I'm joined now by Casey Michelle, investigative reporter with the American news website Think Progress. Casey, welcome to Impact. And do you think this Swedish action could be a problem for American lawyers?
Well, that's an excellent question. That's one of the primary unknowns right now, is exactly how this reopening of this case will affect American efforts to extradite Mr. Assange to face his own case here in the U.S. for conspiring to commit fraud in aiding Chelsea Manning in accessing governmental records. That's a question we don't have an answer to as of yet. Obviously, it was only a couple hours ago that Swedish prosecutors reopened this case. It would seem that it would complicate matters from a legal perspective. However, it does make the case against Assange, at least in the public sphere, that much stronger here in the U.S. Obviously, Mr. Assange is no longer just a publisher or just someone who takes classified information, pushes it to the public. He's now someone who once more is facing very serious rape allegations from Swedish authorities.
And Casey, how important is Mr. Assange in political debate? Who is particularly concerned about, in their view, bringing him to justice?
That's also a great question. Any other time in at least modern American history, theoretically, we would be saying the President of the United States is the one who would be most interested in the developments pertaining to Mr. Assange's situation, especially considering what we saw in 2016 and how Mr. Assange affected the outcome of the American election. But it doesn't seem as if that's the case in 2019 with Donald Trump in the White House. This is a president who doesn't seem to care one way or the other about exactly what is happening with Mr. Assange. Trump is obviously distracted by broader elements of his presidency, broader controversies right now, tensions with China, Venezuela, and Iran, to say nothing of ongoing democratic investigations into his administration and background. It would seem as if it's the intelligence community and national security community that is most interested right now in Assange's fate, not so much the president. He hasn't tweeted about Mr. Assange, let alone commented on his situation, to say nothing of the developments we've seen out of Sweden earlier today. It's unclear whether or not Mr. Trump cares one way or the other what happens to Mr. Assange, which is that much more interesting considering we have an election campaign that is gearing up with 2020 right around the corner.
So as far as the decision is concerned for how hard the U.S. side pushes for extradition, is this then a legal decision rather than a political decision?
Well, no, it is both. Obviously, you have the legal component in terms of the indictment against Mr. Assange, but as I mentioned, with any other administration, this would be the president and the head of the executive branch pushing for some kind of restitution against Mr. Assange that would be in American interests. But as with Mr. Trump, he doesn't seem to care one way or the other what happens to Mr. Assange. If anything, this fits into a broader pattern of what we've seen with the Trump presidency, in which he is relatively hands-off as it pertains to any number of developments, any number of operations, any number of legal pushes one way or the other against those who are perceived to be moving against American interests. Again, in this instance, we would see individuals, higher-ups from the intelligence community and from the national security community pushing for extradition of Mr. Assange to the U.S. and theoretically pushing against extradition to Sweden, if only because that would complicate matters against Mr. Assange here in the U.S. Again, it doesn't seem as if Mr. Trump cares one way or the other. That said, he is again giving leeway to the national security community and the intelligence community to head up this operation and to head up this push for extradition of Mr. Assange to the U.S.
Well, we'll watch this with interest. Casey, thanks very much for joining us live from New York.